Welcome to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Whether you're 25 or 45, there's bound to be a discussion that you care about. Our mission is to share practical ways to find God in your everyday life. And now today's host, Chris Lang.
A recent media personality on CNN requested for viewers to email her stories of addictions that they have overcome, presumably to use on air while discussing this topic. It raises an interesting question, though. Can a person permanently overcome an addiction by himself or herself? If the answer is yes, then those who continue to suffer with addictions apparently do so because of weak minds or weak willpower. But despite the claims of popular people or self-help books, the Bible explains why the problem of addictions is not as simple as just saying no. Hello, I'm Chris Lang, and today's topic is the greatest addiction. Everyone suffers from this addiction, and only one person can free you from it. Our guest today is Kevin Rapert. He lives and works here in the Orlando, Florida area. He's married and enjoys exercise, public speaking, and is a jack of many trades. Welcome to our program today, Kevin.
Thanks, Chris.
It's
nice to be here.
Great to have you. Let's just start out and tell me a little bit about your background. And did you grow up in a Christian home?
I did, actually. I grew up in an Adventist home, as a matter of fact. I was born and raised here in Orlando, Florida. I was the youngest of six. And my mother and father attended the Central Seventh Adventist Church in downtown Orlando.
So you grew up as an Adventist
Mm-hmm.
in the church, and tell me about your personality. I mean, you seem like an outgoing guy, very talented. I mean, what was it that kind of got your life going? What is it that you fell into as far as your passions and your interests?
Well, I was always interested in living on the edge. I mean, things of high energy, adrenaline rush type of things were what got me going, and I often participated in sports and athletics. I was very good at that. I, of course, enjoyed football. I played football for many years, and those are the types of things that I enjoyed doing as a youngster.
Well, now, you obviously are a good-looking guy. You've done some modeling, as I understand it. I mean, hey, any person who can appreciate God's creation knows
Sure.
God gave you a gift of good looks. And so you did some modeling, and you obviously had good-looking girlfriends.
Sure. That could be a blessing and a curse. I think for many years, I thought at least the world revolved around me. And I, of course, took advantage of that. At a young age, I'd say by 12 or 13, I mean, I participated in Pathfinders and all that stuff, but it was more of a forced issue. My father wanted us to go to church, and we were to go to church whether we liked it or not. And quite honestly, I enjoyed it for a few years anyway, but as I got older and got more interested in girls and things like that, I tended to started listening more to the radio and rock and roll and those types of interests. And I found myself often skipping out of church service and while my family was in there and going to listen to the radio on the rock stations out in the parking lot until church service was over.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where I started to separate myself from having to go to church. And I come from a typical, I'd say, semi-dysfunctional or completely dysfunctional type family. My parents, having 6 kids, they did the best they could, but my father was more interested in earning money and doing those types of things and not so much spending time with us. And so I found myself isolating myself from the church and those kind of activities.
So you kind of found yourself connecting with other men, similar ages that were mentoring you into your young manhood, and then
Sure.
You got into a career. You got very successful in what you were doing. Were you working in sales for a while?
Yeah, in fact, my first job was in sales. I was with a computer peripheral company. I did that for a few years, and I realized that, sales is limited by how much you want to work. I mean, you can make as much money as you want to. There's a lot of freedom and fun, if you will, that goes along with that. which was exactly what I didn't need. I found out later in life that I deal better in a more structured environment. But I continued on the sales path. I worked with some large companies in the past, and it fed that lifestyle, and it continued to feed that lifestyle.
Now, one of the things I learned a few years ago from experts in the psychology field is that observable unhealthy behaviors are only about 10% of the human condition.
Right.
When did you notice you started engaging in unhealthy addictive behaviors, and what did that look like for you?
Well, being a recovering addict, it's hard, even to this day, it's hard to admit that you're an addict. But I had older brothers, and the brother closest to me was 7 years older than I was. We weren't a family of wealth, and so we had a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and we all shared a room, and I shared a room with my 18-year-old brother. And at that time, my brother was starting to go to concerts, and I'm not talking about gospel concerts. I'm talking about rock concerts.
Right.
And I was in his room, our room, one day, and I noticed a bag of some substance in the room. And I didn't know what it was, so I come out as a kid, and I'm like, "What is this?" And of course, my whole family was sitting on the couch watching TV, and I could see my brother's jaw drop. Come to find out, it was a bag of marijuana. And of course, that sparked my interest. I didn't know what it was, but all I know is that it got my brother in a lot of trouble. And so I started asking my friends in the neighborhood, about what this was that I had found. And they had told me that it was reefer. And you smoked it. You rolled it and smoked it. And of course, being a typical 11 or 12-year-old, I wasn't going to be happy until I did just that. And so I took some of it, and I remember to this day going down to a local lake where I used to go fishing, and we used to ride our bikes down there, and I rolled it up and started smoking it. And all I know is I didn't like the first feeling of engaging in that. In fact, it scared me a lot, to the point that I had tunnel vision, and I just felt really weird. And so it scared me to the point where I actually got up on the roof on one of our forts, and I started crying. I didn't know what this was all about.
Kind of scared you.
It did scare me, yeah. And so I didn't really partake of any more until I started getting in the trouble years of the teens.
So the escaping, they talk about the power trip, the illusion of control, the escaping.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, was it more, did you sense any, looking back, can you see any of that was happening in your teenage years? When did you actually see that there was a defining moment that happened to you?
Well, I think the defining moment that when I started to party on a regular basis is when I got kicked out of elementary school. I was in 8th grade attending an Adventist Christian school here locally, and I was actually out back smoking a joint with one of the other students that he had brought to the class, and so we went out there and we smoked it. At this point, I was around 13, 14. And I enjoyed it much more the second time. Now, having come from a family where addiction had permeated his life, my father's life, it really didn't play a part in my mother's life. But my father's life, my father survived a violent alcoholic for a father, and he used to be very violent to his mother and to the kids as well.
So getting into addictions was almost in your bloodstream, a genetic predisposition to being addicted to a substance.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
So you got kicked out, and fast forward. When did you start using regularly? Did you end up using other substances along the way? Sure.
Well, it was at that point that I went to public school for the first time after, I was in 8th grade, so I had gone through the private school system. So naturally I was scared. I wanted to fit in, but I didn't know anybody, and I think that's a tough trial for any 13-year-old. And in order to fit in, one of the first persons that I met was a good friend of mine. Not so much to this day, but at that time he came in from the guidance counselor. They asked him to show me around the new school. And the first words out of his mouth once we cleared the guidance office was, "Hey man, do you party?" And of course I thought about it for a couple of seconds and I said, "Yeah, of course." And that really sparked the summer of, I call it, wretched debauchery in excess. I started smoking pot on a daily basis, and from pot it went to alcohol, and of course it eventually ended up with my drug of choice, which was cocaine. I tried cocaine at an age of around 14, 15, and absolutely loved it. It made me feel like Superman. It had a euphoric feeling. I just liked it, and since I was always the type of person that had that electric personality, liked living on the edge, speed, cars, fast women, that kind of thing, it kind of went hand in hand with my personality. Unfortunately for me at the time, I couldn't afford it. It was a very expensive drug, and so I continued smoking the pot, drinking the alcohol, going to the rock concerts and stuff, and I started getting farther and farther away from my church and my family.
So then you got married, and married a beautiful cheerleader from a professional football team.
Yep.
And life was successful. You had the world by the tail, didn't you?
Well, yeah, or so I thought anyway.
So the world told you so.
That's right. That's right.
You had all of the nice stuff, cars and boats and a beautiful woman on your arm, and
sure.
But how did that go for you?
Well, life was pretty easy at that time. I mean, in today's society, if you're good looking and you make money and all these types of things, doors tend to be open for you, as opposed to those that may not be so good looking and may not have those types of things. And so I did. I felt like the world revolved around me, and that I could do just about anything I wanted. And one of the things that I was looking for in life was to have a trophy wife. It wasn't about so much the love as it was the good looks and the status. And having gotten involved with sales, I was making pretty decent money at the time. In fact, it was as a result of a large commission check that I had made that I found, actually it was somebody who used to shine my shoes, a connection that could get me cocaine on a regular basis. And it was at that point that I would get a little bit, and of course I would go and do it. And for me, my wife partied a little bit too, and the difference was the fact that she could party and then she could go and be with her friends and talk and this and that, and she could walk away from the table. I could never do that. When I would do a line of cocaine, it was like everything else shut down. I had blinders on, and the only thing I could think about is getting that next line, and I wouldn't get up from the table until it was gone.
Well, hold that thought. There was a point in time when Kevin hit the ground, and stay tuned. We'll be right back after this message. You're listening to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Welcome back. I'm Chris Lang, your host on Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. I'm here in the studio today with Kevin Rapert, who's telling his story that really relates to all of us, the greatest addiction. Welcome back, Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, as the famous Winston Churchill once said, we're at the end of the beginning.
Right.
And in reality, it wasn't the beginning of the end for you, because God had other plans for your life.
Right.
We were in the middle of a cocaine binge, I think, before the break.
Sure.
And you had what the world described as a successful life going on in your young adult years, but you were coming in for a crash landing, weren't you?
Absolutely. In fact, I had a beautiful wife. I had a nice home. I was making a six-figure income. But for one reason or another, and we could discuss that when we have more time, I absolutely hated myself. I didn't like who I was, and there was no substance to my soul. And what I found is that I started loving the cocaine more than I loved my wife. I could feel God tugging at my heartstrings, but I constantly turned the other way and was running the other way. I didn't want to hear that because, as far as I was concerned, God wasn't cool, and
religion was boring.
Religion was boring.
Wasn't relevant to you.
Yeah, it was kind of forced down my throat. I didn't really care for it. I could hear him, I could feel him talking and pulling at my heart, but I just didn't want to hear it. And so, and the weird thing about cocaine is that in the beginning, it started off as a very social drug. It was great. Life was great. You could just talk for hours on it and share the powers of the universe and talk about everything. But what started evolving is it started creating a monster within. And that monster started isolating. Mm-hmm. And really, when I look back on it, I can see how Satan started to separate me from the flock. And he started destroying my life. And there was really nothing I could do about it. At this point in time, cocaine had such a hold on me that it was the greatest love in my life, and I couldn't conceivably let it go.
So you basically came in and started losing one thing after the other, didn't you?
Yeah.
Because of this addiction, you lost your wife, you lost your job, you had some trouble with the law.
Sure.
And then what happened to you?
Well, I went to rehab. I would constantly go to NA meetings and AA meetings, but the reality is that I hadn't hit a point in my life where I was ready to give up. I was doing all those things for all the wrong reasons. I was doing those things to try to save a marriage, to try to appease my parents. But in reality, my mind was still scheming about going back, and soon as the coast was clear, to going right back to my first love. My wife tried to stay with me at this point, it was about 13 years into a marriage. She stayed with me for another couple of years and just realized that she couldn't compete. She couldn't compete with the drugs that were taking her husband. And so she left me. And of course, that just threw me into a catapult and a downspin, if you will, of using more cocaine, because I didn't want to feel, at this point in time, I didn't want to feel what life was dealing me at this stage. And of course, that led to the loss of a great job that I had, and so I lost my income. Therefore, I lost my house. The next came the car. I lost my car, and I was losing everything. And I found myself basically and literally digging ditches for work and whatever I could find to maintain my addiction and to continue doing it.
But God didn't leave you there.
No.
You were on your back after a 3-day binge one day, and the Lord impressed you to do something. What happened? Where did you go?
Well, yeah, and I've had hundreds of those 3-day binges and gone through countless thousands of dollars. But at this particular stage, I hated myself so much that I was contemplating thoughts such as suicide, and that I just couldn't live with this anymore. I saw what it had done in my life. I saw that I was losing everything. My parents, nobody trusted any word that came out of my mouth. And I didn't care about life itself. And so after this 3-day binge, I had lost my house, so I was living with my mother at the time, and she was just completely distressed about this whole situation. She could see the pain in my heart, but could do nothing about it. Mm-hmm. At this stage, I was a 40-year-old man that she allowed to live in her house, and I came home after a 3-day binge, and I tried to get some sleep, but of course the anxiety and the effects of the drugs just wouldn't allow me to do that. And it was at that very moment, at the precipice of the worst time of my life, that God, I believe in my heart, knew that I was ready. I was ripe. And I heard this voice in my heart, in my conscience, that said, get up. And about a year earlier, I had met Derek Morris at the Forest Lake Church. I had gone a couple times, met him, but I didn't know him. And his name came into my mind. And as clear as I'm talking to you today, it said, go see Derek Morris. And so I felt that it was exactly what I had to do. Almost like when Jesus called Peter from the boat as they were fishing and said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what happened. And I came into Derek's office, and he was on his way out with his briefcase, and my heart kind of dropped because I wanted to talk to him. Come to find out, he was just quite simply going home to do some work at home, and he, of course, made time for me. I sat on the couch, and I told him basically my life story. And I told him that the only thing I had left was my life. That was it. And even that was questionable if I continued the use of the cocaine and the drugs. He proceeded to ask me if I would come to the Wednesday night house of prayer. And I reluctantly accepted. And when I got there, it was funny. There was a scheduled testimony that was supposed to take place. And evidently, that person didn't show up that night. And so Derek came over to me, and now keep in mind, I had been using cocaine for 3 days. My voice box was numb. I looked like, well, the words I could use to describe her probably shouldn't be used on the radio, but I just didn't look very well.
You didn't feel like you were on the top of your game.
I didn't feel like I was on the top of my game for sure. But I hesitantly agreed.
So you actually told your story that night, and you got a lot of love from that group that night.
I did. In fact, I basically fell on my knees, and I was just crying out to the crowd, and I told my story in sobbing. And as Derek tells the story, he asked that if there's any mothers out there that are hurting and suffering or have similar situations, if they would come forward and pray with me in the front of the house of prayer. And he describes it as a tsunami of mothers that came and put their hand on me that night, and they prayed for me and anointed me that night.
Well, I tell you what, in the couple minutes we have left, time flies, Kevin, let's talk about the greatest addiction that we talked about at the beginning. Everyone listening today has something in their life that they know in their deepest soul that they struggle with. And let's talk about what steps people need to do as they listen today. You obviously have had a journey, and that journey required you to make some hard choices. When Jesus went to the man at the pool of Bethesda, who had been sick for 38 years, he asked him a question. Do you want to get well? That's found in the book of John, chapter 5. That man had to respond in his heart in order to receive the gift of healing. What would you say to someone who's struggling with this battle of self, whatever it is that their addictive behaviors are causing them to do today?
Sure. Well, as I've grown in the Lord, I've come to find out that really the drugs, the alcohol, the pornography, all those things that I was addicted to were really just symptoms of the biggest problem. And the biggest problem and the greatest addiction, in my opinion, is self. We always get in the way when God's trying to do things, and that was my problem. But I was at a point in time in my life where I was ready to get out of my way, or ready to get out of God's way and allow Him to work in my life and completely surrender. And that really, I think, was the breaking point, is that we have to get to a place where we're ready to completely surrender our will to Christ and allow Him to work His miracle in our life. And the fact that I'm here talking to you today is a miracle.
God's blessed you since you've turned to Him. You've had daily choices to make. At one point, you were coming to teach a 12-step program, and you told me briefly, that you were actually tempted to use some drugs when you got to the church one night.
Sure.
And the Spirit convicted you, didn't He? That you can't live duplicitously and serve me.
Right.
And you had to make a choice. So we're not talking about a one-time surrender, are we?
No.
We're talking about constant, minute by minute sometimes.
Yeah, the urge to do drugs, the people, places, and things that a 12-step program talks about is true. And at the time, in fact, I was chairing these 12-step regeneration meetings, and yet I still had a dirty little secret. And as a lot of us do, we get rid of the big thing, but yet we don't want to let go of the dirty little things or the little things that in my opinion, sometimes matter the most. And I still smoked marijuana on a regular basis. In fact, I was out here, I had just gotten off the boat, so to speak,
30 seconds.
From my honeymoon.
30 seconds, brother.
And
you got remarried, by the way. God gave you a God-fearing wife.
He did. Yeah. And I literally had to pray to that, God, I can't do this. You have to do this. I don't have the strength. And it was at that point that I threw away the pot for good.
And ever since then, it's been a daily decision to serve God, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has, and He's blessed my life in so many ways. He really
Kevin,
has.
thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
God loves you, friend. He can help you overcome any struggle, no matter how strong, if you ask Him with a sincere heart. All He asks is that you make Him first in your life and surrender control to Him. In return, He promises that your burden will be light and freedom from addictive behaviors. Why? Because He will carry your load when you lay it down. 1 Peter 5, verse 7 says, "Cast all your anxieties on Him, for He cares about you." God bless you, friends.
Hope on Fire is produced by Livestreams Media, a listener-supported ministry. To download a free copy of today's program or be a part of our social network, please visit our website at hopeonfire.org. You may also contact us by writing to Livestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860, or online at hopeonfire.org. Thank you so much for your letters and continued support. Until next time, may God set your hope on fire.